Thank you all for coming, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. Ήθελα να πω λίγα λόγια στα αγγλικά. Καταρχήν, I wanted to say just a few words in Greek. Θα ήθελα πάρα πολύ να ευχαριστήσω θερμά το Athens Center που μας φιλοξενεί σήμερα, και δεύτερον, ιδιαίτερα χίλια ευχαριστώ στο Ίδρυμα Fulbright στην Ελλάδα, το οποίο με έχει υποστηρίξει όχι μόνο μία φορά, αλλά δύο φορές. Δηλαδή, ήμουν απότροπος από το Fulbright πριν μερικά χρόνια, όταν έκανα την έρευνα που θα συζητήσω σήμερα, και με καινούργια έρευνα που κάνω τώρα σχετικά με την ανθρωπιστική κρίση. Και είμαι πολύ τυχερή. Και τελευταία θα ήθελα πολύ να αναγνωρίσω την δάσκαλά μου από παλιά, την Άννα Μαρκοβιεδάκη, με την οποία ξεκίνησα να μαθαίνω ελληνικά το 2004, και όταν έκανα εντατικά μαθήματα εδώ, αλλά μετά όταν είχα πει στο πεδίο, ας πούμε, και δεν πρόλαβα το έντονο πρόγραμμα εδώ, με δέχτηκε σπίτι της κάθε Κυριακή, όταν ήμουν χάρια από έρευνα, ήπιαμε καφέδες, μιλούσαμε, και σιγά σιγά έμαθα λίγο τη γλώσσα, και η περιπέτεια μου με την ελληνική γλώσσα συνεχίζει, και δεν νομίζω ότι θα τελειώσει ποτέ. Thank you so much to the Athens Center that's hosting us today. I actually started learning Greek here in 2004. So it's actually the first space where I came and actually fell in love, not just with Greece, but really Athens. So it's a real honor to do my first book presentation here. And secondly, to the Fulbright Foundation in Greece. Artemis, I'm so pleased to see you here, of course. But I've been so lucky to have my work supported by the Fulbright, both as a student and now as a professor, as I go on to do a second project at a very different moment, I think, in Greece's emergent history. And I wanted to recognize my wonderful Greek teacher, Anna, and friend, who has been working with me for a number of years now. And so thank you. I said I would speak a few words in Greek to show that I've learned something. But, and Rose, I promised as well. So there's a lot that we can talk about when we talk about asylum in Greece, and immigration in Greece more broadly. And there are a lot of people who can say much more learned things about things like law, legislation, the situation on the borders. Honestly, the situation today, since it's changing every day, it's changed every year since I began working on this project. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about my methodology, the kind of research I did to write the book that I wrote, and then I'm going to focus on some of the sort of key, what I see as the key questions or issues that come out of the book that I think might still be relevant, or I hope are relevant for today's Greece and for the emergent Greece that we don't know what that will look like in the near or far future either. And so I'm going to try to sort of emphasize what an anthropologist has to offer to this conversation, because anthropology, it's funny, I'll start with just a little side story. When I first started doing my fieldwork here, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but a lawyer who was a very important interview participant, I remember asked me, and he was like a chain smoker, so he's like, Katsi, sit down. Okay, tell me, what exactly does an anthropologist do? And I was at a loss for words. And he was like, don't you think it's a little strange not to be able to describe your own profession? And I still have trouble describing my own profession, especially because I'm now a teacher, an author, and for all sorts of things. But I'll try to tell you a little bit about what anthropologists do. Okay, so this is the book. There was a picture of it, but it's okay. This is the book. It's called On the Doorstep of Europe, Asylum and Citizenship in Greece. Maybe I'll just, let's see. You'll see it. You'll see a picture at some point. Yes. We'll work on it. Don't worry, it's okay. There's a picture on the cover of the book, which is of literally probably almost 1,000 people sitting outside of Petrolali, which is actually, some of you might have actually been there, not just people who have sought asylum, but it's the police department for Alababon, of aliens, okay? In Athens, and that's where asylum seekers used to have to go and make their asylum applications, which is actually a little bit strange if you think about it, because that means people who are, at least in theory and most often in practice, afraid of their state would have to go literally to the police office of the new state in order to seek protection. And so there were hundreds of people, and they'd been sleeping there for days, and this was a common phenomenon at that time. And Salvatore, my partner, came with me and he took this picture, which was kind of a dangerous thing to do as well at that time. So there's been an issue of asylum around asylum and migration for a long time in Greece, but I think it's really entered the center of the public sphere in a new way now, and so I'm hoping I can make a little bit of sense of that at the end. Okay, so in the book, I try to think of the asylum process not as this kind of legal, formal process. Okay, first of all, especially in Greece, if you think of something or a bureaucratic process as something that's simple, that's going to be your first error. But that's the case pretty much anywhere. The law isn't something that, just lawyers think about. Every one of us uses and makes sense of the law, legislation, policy in our own ways. I mean, I think a really good example, for instance, is like parking in Athena. Okay, you have very formal rules that sometimes are enforced. Okay, sometimes they were taking the license plates off of cars in Exarchia the other day, but usually it's not. So there's a lot of elasticity in the way we think about the law. So as an anthropologist, as a legal anthropologist, I approach the asylum procedure in Greece not just as something that was abstract or something that only lawyers had access to, but as a site of encounter, okay, where all sorts of people from many different backgrounds, literally places, would have to meet each other in a very, 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 very difficult, challenging context. So I guess my question was kind of, what did these kinds of encounters make possible? Okay. So I characterize the asylum procedure in the book as, not just the asylum procedure in Greece, but especially the asylum procedure in Greece, as a process that is absolutely and totally shaped by, I would say, irreconcilable dilemmas, okay, on all sides, okay? And the central dilemma at the heart of asylum law is the question of who has a right to protection in this territory of another nation state, okay? And if you imagine that that person who's seeking protection does not have access to their own country of citizenship, are not able to live in a way that is safe, okay, let's just say live, okay, basic. We're not talking good lives, necessarily. But let's add the good life. So you can't have a good life in your own country. And you have to leave and go somewhere else, okay? The question then becomes, for people who make decisions about who gets asylum and who does not, who has the right to live, really? I mean, that's how, maybe I'm being slightly hyperbolic, I don't know. We probably have some lawyers or people in the room who know more about this. But the way I frame asylum law is, this is a central dilemma that people who work with refugees and asylum seekers, and refugees and asylum seekers themselves, are working around all the time. And just to give you a little bit of background, you're probably already familiar with this, but if I can just read to you the definition, the legal, formal definition of a refugee from the 1951 Geneva Convention. A refugee is someone who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, is unable to, or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country or return there because of fear of persecution. When I read that, and when I think about that sort of window of protection that international law has carved out and which nation states have agreed to implement, what strikes me is how small it is. it's a very small group of people who can actually qualify for that small window of protection. And there are many, many people who are on the out edges, who are on the outside, who don't qualify at all, but might need protection of a different kind. That's one dilemma. You have people who are dealing with this question about the right to life in a territory, in a country, within a very small framework. Okay, that's not very elastic. Okay, the second thing I wanted to sort of highlight about asylum law, that's another dilemma, I would say central dilemma, is that this is an international legal framework. And yet, and Hannah Arendt has written about this in great detail, if you've read anything by her, in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. This law that's international has to be implemented, in most cases, by nation states. Okay? And Saskia Sassen, did anyone go hear her talk the other day? She's this, yeah, so she's this professor, a philosopher, thinker, sociologist, but she said really early on in her career, actually, that human rights actually, at least in theory, but certainly in practice, oftentimes infringe on the sovereignty of nation states in some cases. So in some cases, something that is valued by human rights law may not be exactly what the state in question wants to support. Okay? And I think, you know, your introduction, you highlighted that. You have, on the one hand, the need for protection, right? But you also have a state, a nation state, that is its own situation of crisis that may or may not, that likely does not, seriously does not, have the capability to implement that. Okay. And I want to frame asylum, I guess, and asylum in Greece, and then I'll move on a little bit more to what I actually did. Paul Farmer, have you heard of him? He's a medical anthropologist. He's kind of a public intellectual as well, and he works in these incredibly difficult contexts. He's worked a lot in Haiti, Rwanda, and as well as in Russian prisons. But he has really developed this idea of structural violence, which for my students, they always find it a little bit counterintuitive because we think of violence as something that's spectacular, that's aberrant, that's somehow outside the norm. But for him, structural violence, and he bases a lot of this on Marx and sort of good Marxist theory, but that violence can be built into systems as well. And so certain people are born in situations that allow them to succeed, and you know, other people are not. And of course, people have agency, people can act in the world, but the asylum system is shaped absolutely, I would say, by multiple forms of structural violence. You have forms of spectacular violence, oftentimes, in countries of origin, but you also have the much more insidious violence of the law. You also have racism, hidden, not so hidden, okay? You have daily forms of exclusion that people are subjected to. You have questions of gender. You have all sorts of things that come to play in this. You have limited financial and emotional resources for dealing with these kinds of things. So what I try to do in my book, rather than sort of saying, okay, asylum seekers are over here, decision makers are over here, lawyers and social workers are over here, I try to look at them as all people, okay? That is one thing that captures us, we are people, right? And we're trying to make sense and make meaning, live somewhat meaningful lives out of a really, really difficult situation, okay? And to me, that's a really human story. And I guess, you know, if there's a humanistic aspect to my work, I think that's the kind of story I try to tell in the book. Okay, so just a few words about anthropology as a method and sort of what I did. Has anyone here actually studied anthropology? Okay, so a lot of times I say I'm an anthropologist, particularly in Greece, and people think immediately about archaeology, okay, or the ancient world. Or in the US, it's usually like, you're going to go look at something that's really exotic. It usually is in Africa or South America, you know, or maybe it's in Indonesia or something, right? The idea that there are anthropologists doing work with like police in rural United States, or high court in Argentina, or asylum process in Greece is a little bit counterintuitive sometimes, I think. But basically, anthropologists, I would say, at least in my view, okay, we collect data, we make meaning out of things by as one of my mentors called it, intensively and systematically hanging out. Okay. And I think it kind of captures what we do. I mean, and it's intensive. I mean, it's intensive hanging out, but it's somewhat systematic. But really, it's passing time with people. And, you know, and I don't say this is the only kind of work that is valuable. We need statistics, we need historians, we need archives, we need all of that. But I think what anthropologists offer to the world, I guess, or the academic world, is a sort of long-term, we call it participant observation. It seems like you keep on it, you see, okay, you spend time in a place and you get to know people sort of on their terms. At least that's the goal. It's a little more challenging than you think it might be. So I came to Greece in 2005. I did some initial research, but I really spent almost 2 years here at an NGO, based at an NGO that at that time was one of the most, I would say, crucial instruments for providing legal and social assistance to asylum seekers and refugees in Greece. So it was kind of an entry point, a threshold or doorway, okay, to all sorts of other kinds of data that were interesting for me as well. And so I looked out from that space, which was a small office, okay, relatively, and moved to sort of doing a lot of interviews with different refugee communities, and Hussein helped me a lot with that. We'll hear from him in a minute. I went to Brussels, I went to the European Parliament, I went to Mytilene, I went to the north. So it was kind of, I went from the micro out. So the sort of, the field site was like a space where I could spend time and really get to know the daily routines of people, but then it also provided me with contacts and spaces that were really important for the overarching picture of my work. And I came back and did research every summer up until 2012. And I even got to spend some time, thanks to some colleagues, in the asylum division at Petrurali for a few days, which was a huge coup at that time. So I was able to actually address some of what was actually happening in the bureaucratic state asylum procedure as well. And I just want to highlight that what anthropologists do, you know, is not something that's very different from what we do every day, I think, as people. Although we try to do it in a somewhat more systematic way. For instance, there are a lot of anthropologists. I would say some of the most important anthropological work in Greece has been done by Greeks who come from Greece. There are some wonderful anthropology departments in Greece, Athens, Mytilene, but also in the north, Macedonia, both universities up there. We have Thessaly. It's not that you have to go somewhere far away and exotic. You know, with my students, if you even think about entering a new workplace, or like going to a party, or entering a new neighborhood, okay, every sort of social context has its own set of sort of tacit and explicit rules. And so what we sort of seek to do is spend time in a place, start to look at it, you know, maybe for me as an outsider, the things that are familiar for Greeks every day will seem strange. And so sometimes I'll look like a total idiot as a result of that. You know, I'll make daily silly mistakes, and in that way, you know, through that enculturation process, I start to realize the things that make that space unique, okay? The same can be said for, I think, people who are trying to look critically at their own cultural space as well. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of make accessible the work that anthropologists do. I think that that's also something else that we have to offer, so that sort of epistemic community. Okay. But I think the thing that I wanted to highlight most of all, and which is why I'm so pleased to have my good friend Ali Hussein with me today, is that it's deeply, deeply collaborative, the work we do. I mean, my field work was just times, it was going to weddings, it was going to dinners, it was people who agreed to spend, you know, an hour with me, people who fought with me sometimes. It was people taking time sometimes to tell me really difficult things. It was me telling them really difficult things. Sometimes these turned into relationships, friendships that lasted, sometimes not so much. But either way, it was people who were generous enough to share their time with me, you know, who was honestly a bumbling graduate student at the time, and, you know, really didn't know which ways it was up in many ways. So people really I feel like this now, as I'm doing my research now, and I feel again like a child in a lot of ways. So the collaborative nature, I wrote the book, but the stories in there, the things, all the insights in there are things that came about in conversation with people and spending time with people. And so that's why it's really amazing to be able to present my work in Greece here as well. I wanted to show you a video. Sorry, I started to switch. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video, and then we're going to hear from my friend Ali for a little bit. And then I was going to outline what some of the major, some of those dilemmas that I was talking about and how they played out in my field site, without speaking for too long, hopefully. So one thing that's been striking to me is, particularly with the Syrian refugee crisis, a lot of people here have said to me, it's become an issue. It was an issue for a really long time, okay, for the past, since 2004, 2005, okay. And so the UNHCR, in particular, they launched a number of advertising campaigns, and we're doing a lot of really important advocacy work here in Greece at that time. And one of their campaigns was the following video, okay, and I'm going to play it for you. And I just want to ask you to think about, when you hear the term refugee or asylum seeker, I think Kyrios Zervos' comment at the beginning was really poignant for thinking about, if you're a refugee, are you a refugee? What does that mean? How much does that shape your identity? Like, in your history? I mean, at what point do you stop being a refugee? Do you have to play the role of the refugee? What expectation, if you're not a refugee, if you're Greek, if you're American, if you're British, if you're from somewhere else, if you're privileged like me, what do you think a refugee is? Are they a victim? Are they, are they the exile that, are they like, what's his name? He wrote Night. And Elie Wiesel, is that the refugee? So, what kind of image of a refugee do you have in the back of your mind? Okay. So, let me just get this going. Let's see, hold on. It might just take me a minute. I have this all set up perfectly. I don't think I need to do like a simultaneous translation or anything. But it's in Greek, but I want you to pay attention to the images, okay?
Υπάρχουν γύρω μας φαντάσματα. Κάποτε είχαν ζωή.
There are ghosts around us.
Είχαν το σπίτι τους. Τους δικούς τους ανθρώπους. Και μετά όλα χάθηκαν. Και έμεινε μόνο η αγωνία. Γιατί θέλουν να γυρίσουν στη ζωή που τους ανήκει. Στη ζωή που κανένα ανθρώπινο δίκαιο και καμιά λογική δεν έπρεπε να τους έχει στερήσει. Αυτά τα φαντάσματα τα λένε πρόσφυγες. Και είναι γύρω μας άνθρωποι σαν και εμάς, αλλά κυνηγημένοι, τρομαγμένοι από διωγμούς και πολέμους. Φοβάστε να τους κοιτάξετε κατάματα. Είπατε η αρμοστία του ΟΗΕ για τους πρόσφυγες.
The gist of this was an advertising campaign that was, there are ghosts around us. At one time they had a life, they had their homes, they had their own people, or the people that belonged to them. Okay, but now they're around us, anthropis animas, people like us, but they're hunted, they're frightened, they're traumatized from expulsions and wars. And at the end, this question, are you afraid to look them in the eyes? And I think that says a lot about how we think about refugees. So with that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ali Hussein. Come up, please.
It may be a little bit difficult to speak after those two distinguished persons. They summarize had everything. But as you have seen, I'm one of those ghosts who lived here in Greece. I even lost my identity because trying to flee my country, I had to change my name. My real name is not Ali Hussein, but I had to keep the name because it was registered in the official papers that I entered Greece. I entered Greece legally, not like most of the people who ran the risk of losing their lives trying to cross the borders into Greece. I want to thank Ms. Capleton for her efforts to make our problems known to most of the people. It's not only about a book to be read, something that helps us to be identified, to be recognized. We are not just number in statistics or some foreigner who came here to cause economical problems to Greece. And I'm astonished because all over time, immigration was the type of way people immigrated from this country to the second country to the third country. It was allowed, there were no borders, and our country is a country of immigrants all over here. And to be specific also about refugees, we should put in mind that many very important people were refugees. Jesus was a refugee, Einstein was a refugee. We didn't come just with a bag of old clothes, trying to find a better life. I wish I was still in my country, in my home, with my family. But that was impossible. I had to flee. It may be a little bit difficult for me to speak because it brings out many memories. But, sorry, I cannot continue. I just want to thank Ms. Cabot and all the people in you who are here to support us, to know better about us, and we really appreciate that. Thank you.
So as you probably, maybe you're thinking the same thing. When I first saw that video, I laughed because Ali Hussein is one of the most clever, sassy, you didn't get his sass, but his sassy, funny, intelligent people I know. And what was amazing was that, you know, in order to somehow speak to a public, you know, and get people interested, you know, he's the ghost somehow, you know, without a history, or with a history that can't be talked about. And I think that's the thing that I want to sort of highlight. I want to sort of de-exceptionalize refugees. And I think, you know, the point, I'm thinking, or asylum seekers, or whoever the other is, whoever the Xenos is in Greece right now, I want you to invite to think about that a little more critically. As we know, there's this really long history of displacement in, you know, Mediterranean, but also Greek refugees who, when they first came, were Turkey, or often called Turkey, not refugees. Been living in Vironas with a long history of that. We also have, you know, the ancient world, which I'll move to in just a minute. But I just wanted to, when I was speaking about collaboration, Mr. Hussein was one of the people who really was an entry point for